In the early 1980s, a tsunami smashed into the United States, devastating neighborhoods and profoundly altering culture and livelihoods across the nation. The emergence and subsequent epidemic of crack cocaine is a chilling story intertwined with sagging socio-economic factors, failed drug policies, and shady international politics. This is when the US prison system more than doubled, as did the national murder rate compared with the 1960s, and the divide between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, became a gulf. The crack epidemic savaged many parts of the United States, leaving areas mere shadows of what they once were during the affluent 1950s. It was a period that caused catastrophic harm to many families across the country, with a massive rise in single-parent households, children in foster care, fetal death rates, and of course addiction. This wave of misery may have started more than 40 years ago, but the suffering caused is still very much being felt today. Many neighborhoods that were wrecked by the arrival of crack still haven't recovered, and for many Americans, the cycle of pain has simply passed to newer generations. But perhaps the worst thing about the entire crack episode was that those who suffered worse because of it were almost exclusively poor, and more often than not, of a minority background. Powdered cocaine and crack are essentially the same thing, and yet the criminal justice approach to the two couldn't have been more different. One was favored by the rich, often white population, with relatively lenient sentences, except for massive amounts, while the other could be bought for scraps, favored by the poor, and particularly popular in African-American neighborhoods, but it came with draconian penalties, the likes of which the United States had never seen before for drugs. Unfair doesn't even begin to cut it. This is a story that goes deep into the heart of the United States, and it begins at the end of a disco decade in a nation where the American dream was, for many, slowly turning into a nightmare. As the United States reached the end of the 1970s, all was not well. Economic stagnation, inflation, racial disparities, and urban decay were all taking hold. Many parts of the country were slipping further and further behind, creating zones of real poverty in the richest country in the world. Economic stagnation, coupled with high inflation, supercharged this problem, with inflation rates reaching double digits by the late 1970s, significantly impacting the cost of living. The post-World War II economic boom was slowing dramatically. Employment rates plummeted, especially in urban areas. The late 1970s and early 80s saw a shift in the American economy from manufacturing to service-oriented industries, leading to significant job losses in traditional manufacturing hubs, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest. Persistent social and racial disparities further exacerbated problems. Despite the civil rights advancements of the 1960s, many African Americans and other minority groups continued to face systematic inequalities in education, employment, and housing. The economic downturn disproportionately affected these communities, leading to higher rates of poverty, unemployment, and social disenfranchisement. The final factor that laid the groundwork for crack cocaine's explosion onto the American scene was the decline in urban areas. Cities faced a reduction in federal aid, leading to decreased public services. This decline was accompanied by suburbanization, where middle and upper-class families moved to the suburbs, leaving the urban core with a lower tax base and skyrocketing social problems. What came next in many urban areas was harrowing, and there are plenty of regions across the United States still struggling to recover. The scene was set for a tragic epidemic that would carve great crevices into American society. Crack cocaine emerged in the early 1980s when cocaine, a costly drug associated with the affluent, was transformed into a cheaper, smokable form known as crack. This form was more accessible, highly addictive, and could be sold in smaller quantities, making it available to a broader demographic, especially in impoverished urban areas. The production of crack cocaine was a simple process of cooking cocaine with baking soda and water, creating small rocks that could be smoked. The high from crack cocaine was intense, but short-lived, leading to a cycle of addiction and repeated use. To begin with, crack came with a higher purity than street powder. In 1984, powdered cocaine was available with an average of 55% purity for $100 per gram, equivalent to about $300 today. Crack, however, could be purchased with purity levels of 80+% for the same price. However, on the streets, it was rarely purchased in such large quantities. In large cities such as New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Houston, and Detroit, one dose of crack cost as little as $2.50, about $8 today. The economic despair seen in many areas of the country created a fertile ground for the crack market, and it spread across the United States with terrifying speed. Much of the low-level dealing was done by drug gangs such as the Bloods and Crips, while those higher up made insane amounts of money. One of the most famous crack dealers of the age was Freeway Rick Ross, whose gross earnings between 1982 and 1989 were close to $1 billion, about $2.5 billion today. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison, but was released after 20 years after a loophole surrounding his 3 strikes conviction was discovered. The geopolitical landscape also played a role in crack spread. During this period, there was a significant increase in cocaine production in South American countries such as Colombia. US foreign policy indirectly, or some might argue rather directly, contributed to this increase, particularly in Central America, where a lot of drugs passed through. The political turmoil in these regions, partly fueled by Cold War ideologies, facilitated the growth of drug trafficking networks that found a lucrative market in the United States. North of the border, injuries, overdoses, and murders quickly began to mount. In 1985, cocaine-related hospital emergencies rose by 12%, from 23,500 to 26,300. 1986 saw an increase of 110%, and 1987 saw a massive jump to 94,000 incidents. Between 1984 and 1989, the homicide rate for black males aged 14 to 17 more than doubled, with the same group aged 18 to 24 increasing nearly as much. There were other catastrophic consequences for the broader black community, which experienced a 20 to 100% increase in fetal death rates, low birth weight babies, weapons arrests, and the number of children in foster care. The murder rate in general doubled compared to 20 years earlier. The 1960s had a national homicide rate of 5 per 100,000, but that figure jumped to 10.4 during the 1980s. This decade saw the murder rate peak in the United States, and it has since been a downward trend. The last few years fluctuated because of COVID and various economic problems, but with a homicide rate of 6.3 per 100,000, it's still well below the 1980s figures. Now, there are plenty of theories about how crack was able to spread so quickly and with such devastating force. Some allege that the US government was even in on the act. The CIA-Contra crack cocaine controversy is one of the most contentious and debated episodes in recent American history. It involves allegations that the CIA was complicit in the trafficking of crack cocaine into the United States to fund the Contras, a guerrilla fighting force against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua in the 1980s. The US government under the Reagan administration was vehemently opposed to the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, which it viewed as a Marxist regime with close ties to the Soviet Union. To counter this, the US supported the Contras, an armed rebel group committed to overthrowing the Sandinista government. However, congressional restrictions in the form of the Boland Amendment limited direct US government assistance to the Contras. In August 1996, a series of articles by journalist Gary Webb in the San Jose Mercury News brought the controversy to the forefront of public consciousness. The articles, under the title Dark Alliance, alleged that the CIA was aware of and tacitly supporting cocaine trafficking by the Contras into the United States. According to Webb's reports, the profits from this drug trafficking were used to fund the Contras, especially during the period when the US government funding was restricted. This is where our friend Freeway Ricky Ross comes back into the picture, allegedly with connections to the Contras and a man named Danilo Blandon. Were these two men in cahoots with the CIA to funnel crack around the country to help fund the Contras? Who knows? It's an enticing story, but there's little real evidence. Webb's articles suggested that this influx of cocaine contributed significantly to the crack epidemic that swept through urban areas in the US in the 1980s, particularly affecting African American communities. The implication that the CIA was indirectly involved in drug trafficking that exacerbated urban blight and social decay caused outrage among the American public. The allegations led to multiple investigations, including those by the CIA itself and US Congress. The CIA's internal investigation concluded that there was no direct or indirect involvement by the agency in drug trafficking to fund the Contras. Similarly, the US Justice Department, following its investigation, found no evidence to support the allegations of direct CIA involvement in drug trafficking. However, these investigations did acknowledge that the Contras were involved in drug trafficking and that some of the individuals who supported the Contras' operations had connections to drug cartels. It was also recognized that the CIA had information about these activities but did not fully pursue them or report them to the appropriate law enforcement agencies. The response to Webb's reporting and the subsequent investigations was mixed. Some criticized Webb's work for overreaching conclusions and lacking sufficient evidence to implicate the CIA directly. Others saw the investigation as a cover-up or insufficient in addressing the gravity of the allegations. The US government's response to the crack epidemic was primarily through a law enforcement and criminal justice approach. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 imposed harsh penalties for drug offenses, particularly for crack cocaine, which were significantly more draconian than those for powdered cocaine. This led to a dramatic increase in incarcerations, disproportionately affecting African American communities. To give you an example of this, the distribution of just 5 grams of crack cocaine in the 1980s was enough to land you a 5-year prison sentence, but you would need to be caught with 500 grams of powdered cocaine to receive the same sentence. This led to the infamous 100-to-1 quantity ratio sentencing, which has never been fully explained. If we were to take a stab in the dark here, we'd say it was because the Wall Street fat cats who were supercharging the economy through various Wolf of Wall Street-style shenanigans were also plowing through epic mountains of powdered cocaine, while the poorer addicts, often minorities, could only afford crack. If you were to create a law that specifically targeted the poor and disenfranchised while allowing those higher up to run amok, this would be that law. This war on drugs approach has been criticized for failing to address the root causes of drug abuse and for exacerbating social inequalities. It led to overcrowded prisons and did little to stem the flow of drugs. Moreover, the focus on criminalization rather than treatment and rehabilitation for drug users prevented many from receiving the help that they needed. The prison numbers here are absolutely staggering. At the start of the 1980s, there were just under 500,000 people in US jails. But by the end of the decade, that figure was close to 1 million and continued to rise through the 1990s. And you probably don't need me to tell you that there was a massive disparity in color. By 1989, 1 in every 4 African-American males aged 20 to 29 was either incarcerated, on probation, or parole, and by 1995, that statistic had increased to nearly 1 in 3. According to the US Sentencing Commission, the number of people incarcerated for drug offenses increased tenfold between 1980 and 1995. These drug policies continue to be a broader trend of mass incarceration in the US, which has had lasting social and economic consequences, particularly for minority communities. The long-term imprisonment disrupted families, and ex-offenders face significant challenges in reintegration, including limited employment opportunities and having their voting rights restricted. This period marked the beginning of a cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement that has persisted for generations in some communities. The crack epidemic had lasting effects on American society. It intensified urban decay, contributed to family disintegration, and overwhelmed the criminal justice system. The social stigma attached to crack addiction and the consequent marginalization of addicts has had severe long-term social and health consequences. Policies enacted during the crack epidemic set a precedent for how drug abuse is perceived and addressed in the United States. The emphasis on punitive measures over treatment and rehabilitation in drug policy has continued to influence the approach to newer drug crises like the opioid epidemic. The health implications of the crack epidemic were profound. Crack cocaine use led to a spike in addiction, overdoses, and related health issues, including the spread of HIV/AIDS and other infectious diseases, mainly through shared needles. Even decades later, the impact on public health continues, with generational trauma and increased susceptibility to drug abuse observed in communities heavily affected by the epidemic. The spread of crack deepened socio-economic disparities, particularly in urban areas. It contributed to urban decline as drug-related crime and the visible presence of addiction deterred investment and economic development in affected neighborhoods. Property values declined, and businesses closed or moved, leading to a cycle of poverty and neglect that in some areas continues to this day. Furthermore, the epidemic disrupted family structures, with a significant number of children placed into foster care due to parental drug addiction or incarceration. Those children, often referred to as crack babies, often faced developmental challenges, adding to the social and economic burden on communities and public services. The US government estimated that as many as 375,000 babies were exposed in utero to illicit drugs during the 80s. Families with a mother or father in jail also faced enormous hurdles. Children growing up in a single-parent household are 3 times more likely to end up in jail at some point in time before they're 30 than those in a 2-parent household. It is a devastating cycle that continues to grind people into the ground. The crack epidemic influenced the political discourse around drugs and crime in the United States, leading to a tough-on-crime approach that dominated policymaking for decades. This approach has been heavily criticized for its contribution to racial disparities in the criminal justice system and for prioritizing incarceration over rehabilitation. And the worst thing of all, the war on drugs simply didn't work. Addiction numbers continue to climb, but when was the last time anybody even talked about getting tough on drugs? Increasingly, it's a shocking story that just gets swept underneath the rug. A study carried out in 2018 found that the crack epidemic has had long-term consequences for crime. It found that the doubling of the murder rate of young black males soon after the start of the epidemic was still 70% higher 17 years after crack cocaine's arrival. The study estimated that 8% of the murders in 2000 were due to the long-term effects of the emergence of crack markets, and that the elevated murder rates for young black males can explain a significant part in the gap of life expectancy between black and white men. I'd love to say that this kind of thing's now behind us, but sadly, that's not the case. Crack cocaine use is still rampant across the country, with statistics from 2021 showing just over 500,000 people in the US had used crack at least once over the last month. The opioid epidemic that swept the United States in 2 waves between 1990 and 2020 has had a similar shattering effect on American society. Fewer people have gone to jail, probably because they can't really fit any more in, but with over 600,000 deaths, it has been another catastrophic episode in US history, this time fueled by legal drugs. These 2 epidemics back to back have profoundly altered American society. Add in the economic crash of 2008 and COVID-19, and it's been a rough 40 years for many in the land of the free and the home of the brave.